Good morning. What a great 2 days. I have learned so much. This is my actual first RICO, and I hope this is not my last on top of that. So as Emma mentioned, the Food Safety and Modernization Act. This is a mega topic for us to talk about in this little bit of time together today. But what I hope to do is from all the learnings you've got, I hope to add to that. And I hope we're able to look and think through some of the implications that you may have along your supply chain and how this regulation in the US has changed our thinking and how you really need to think about your processes. So two things we're going to start with. One, for all those trivia buffs out there, next time you're out at the bar and you're playing that game, this might help you. We're going to do a little bit of history around how regulation changed in the United States, along with a few key outbreaks in which we'd learned from. I apologize, it's prior to lunch. You might not like some of those outbreaks we're going to talk about, but it will be fine. Then we'll also look at how the regulations kind of changed with those learnings for that process. Then we'll dig into FSMA and really look at what prevention means around some key topics. At a very high level, because it's very difficult to kind of dive into each of your individual areas, but we'll look at how those different risk assessments can be done and what you really need to think about through two of those specific rules. So where do we want to start? I'm going to start with an apple. I still have vivid memories as a kid. My grandparents were big on the garden, processing, living off the land. We'd harvest every year, bring that in, produce, put it in jars, cans, whatever, freeze it, right? But the apple orchard was one of those places they'd always come over to our house. They'd bring the bushels. I can still smell the apples. They're on the ground. Those are the ones we're picking up to use. They're starting to maybe ferment a little bit because there is yeast in those cases. They're rotting a little bit. You've had animals and birds chewing on them. But those are the apples that we'd pick up to take back and produce the most amazing products that we could then eat throughout the rest of the year, whether it was applesauce, apple pies, apple dumplings. Man, there's nothing better than that thing coming out of the oven. You can smell the cinnamon, put that vanilla ice cream on top of that. But in that process, if you think about that, we looked at food safety differently, right? There was ways for us to heat and put those things forward. Man, I would love to be able to do that today. I would love to be able to have a garden. I would love to have the time or the space to do that, but I don't. So I really have to depend on the supermarket and our industrialized world that we live in to ensure that I'm getting a food-safe product when I take it home. Think about it. In a very short amount of time with our industrialization, where we could take something small like fire and how that really changed the ability for us to, again, create safe product, safe food for our homes, to what we have today in our homes as a new modernized kitchen. Whether that's freezing, cooling of your food, the microwave, just think of what that did for us in terms of our time and safety. But then you even have a dishwasher. Again, a great way to improve and clean up the processes that you have at home. So now we're going to take that journey for all the Cliff Clavens in us and start to fill your mind with a little bit of that history from the US FDA. So let's go all the way back to pre-Civil War. There was a product at the time, and it was given the name swill milk. This was milk from cows that had been fed swill from the distilleries. So it was very common at that time to have dairies, distilleries right beside each other. On top of that, the milk was highly adulterated. You would cut it with plaster, water, put some egg in it for thickener. But what happened was the New York Times reported that this probably attributed to about 8,000 children deaths at that time. Again, due to an adulterated product because somebody was trying to make profit. It was President Lincoln in 1962 that actually created the Bureau of Chemistry. That's today's predecessor to the FDA. But again, there was no federal food standard at this time. States were responsible for that, and even then they didn't have really standards at that point. Then another game changer came with Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. This really highlighted the area of food safety in the meatpacking industry as well as worker conditions. There was a huge public outcry, and there was demand for change based on this book. So finally, Congress did pass, and President Theodore Roosevelt at the time signed into law the Pure Food and Drug Act. And in this case, this was the first time you had a federal regulation. And what it did is it banned adulterated and misbranded foods in interstate commerce. Again, interstate commerce. It had nothing to do with if it was happening within the state itself. Now, another learning through our world of technology was oysters. So around the mid-20s in New York City, there was an actual outbreak of typhoid. So what was found is oysters are very popular. They were grown right there in the waterways and harvested and used and consumed. But guess what? So was the raw sewage. They were also being dumped right into that waterway. We know oysters are filter feeders. They're going to take in whatever's coming in out of that water. And that was what the attribution was to the typhoid at that time. So again, a learning in terms of how we can better do food processing. Next change to the regulations came with the Federal Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act, signed by the second Roosevelt president. And what came in here was a change in having now standards of identities for foods. All of you love a great bar of milk chocolate. This is the time where they said, okay, if you're going to call it milk chocolate, it can have only these ingredients at these percents in the product. Also, it was the first time the FDA said, guess what? We're going to come in and inspect your facilities when we want to. Now, grass. Not necessarily the grass that we in Washington State talk about. This would be the grass in terms of generally recognized as safe. And so what this was is where the FDA published in the public register a set of ingredients that were really generally consumed prior to 1958. And they considered these safe at that time until otherwise proven, right? So it's now set up a regulatory framework for you to look at. So if you're thinking about innovation, you're thinking about ingredients post 1958. What you need to do is make sure that they're safe and you follow the process that the FDA has set forward to ensure their safety, right? But if you can prove they've been on the market and consumed in the general population of the US prior to 58, you're pretty good to go. And we'll talk a little bit more about that down the presentation. Finally, another learning was in the listeria area. This is where it was first found in a food product, which was raw cheese. So it was a raw milk being used at that time. Listeria was only thought to be something found in hospitals. This was the first time it was found in food and has really changed our thinking. Then the Food and Drug Administration Act came out. This was the first time the FDA became its own agency under the Health and Human Services with a commissioner that was put in by the president and voted on by the Senate. Two more outbreaks of learning. You had the E. coli outbreak in ground meat. This would have been the Jack-in-the-Box cases, where they just cooked the meat longer at a higher temperature. Even though the meat was contaminated, they would have avoided a lot of those issues, so that was a learning. And then you had the raw apple juice area in terms of Odwalla having to recall all of their products due to E. coli. Now, the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act is not what FSMA is. This was actually really looking at how do they modernize things because you had new technology, had trade going on across the world, and so it was really changing the language around the regulation at that time. Which then brings us to today. Again, 2011, President Obama signed into law the Food Safety and Modernization Act. And again, from this standpoint, this is where there was a very much big game change in that. But it's not just signing a law and things happen. Congress has to come forward, FDA has to come forward, and now write what that law looks like. So while they're writing it, two more things of learning. Ice cream, listeria. So Blue Bell had their issues with their listeria contamination. And what they learned there was they need to rethink their cleaning processes, right? When they looked in their facilities, broke down their supply chain and broke down their machinery, they could find it in different places, and they had to learn how to better clean that and then test to make sure it was clean, as well as they now implemented a hold procedure. After the product was made, they tested and ensure it was safe before release. Chipotle, another area, 5 main outbreaks all right together. In some cases, they were able to trace them. In other cases, they weren't. So raw vegetables sometimes are hard to trace because they've already been consumed usually after the impact. But what they weren't sure with a couple of them, it could have been the raw vegetables. It could have been the fact that they have raw meat and raw vegetables all being used in the same retail space. It could have also been, in one case, the norovirus brought in by their employees or a consumer. So FSMA, what is the big game change and prevention and all those things that we've been talking about? That's kind of the key word. So previously, from the FDA standpoint, you looked at a shift from detection and reaction to prevention. If you are going to take the responsibility as a company, produce great products and great food for the consumer, you need to be part of that safe plan. You can't just wait for the FDA to come in and tell you, you now have to be part of that journey. As well as there's two other things that were in there. There was the ability now for the FDA to look at many more of your records. So it's not just the incidents, they can actually look at all your food records now. And 2, they now have mandatory recall. That seems kind of weird. You'd probably think they already had that. Actually, no, the law only was voluntary. Now, granted, if the FDA is going to put something up on their website to say voluntary recall, you're probably going to recall your product just because of the media backlash in that case. But now it's mandatory. So I'm just throwing this up there to show you the complication. It took 7 rules over these 5 years to be written to help understand what this means in our complex supply chain from beginning to end. We're only going to focus on the 2 that I've got highlighted. One is the preventative controls for human food, as well as the food safety, or the foreign supplier verification program. So we'll try to a couple of those main highlights for you to think about in your process. So let's start with the preventive controls and 5 key points. 1, you must have your registered site with the FDA. That doesn't matter if you're in the United States or outside the United States. You must register with the US FDA if you're going to produce food for the US market. 2, this is a very general plan, maybe of a roastery. You need to prepare and implement. So you need to look at the scope of your plant. That includes how the product comes in, how the product goes out. But the key there is you need a preventative control qualified individual. That means they've been trained through the FDA process and certified, or they've been trained by somebody that's also been approved by the FDA to do so. They then are going to write the plan. They're going to look at all of the facility and see where I need to put in controls to make sure that I'm avoiding any possible introduction of risk. So 3rd, while they're doing that implementation, then you want to brainstorm, okay, what are my risks and what are the things we need to think about? 3 key categories, and ones that we've been talking about, all the great microbes. Well, you got to think about the bad ones in this case. Maybe that's Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, right? So that's the biological side. Or you need to think about the chemical side. Maybe that's allergens. What kind of controls do you need to have in place because you might have cross contact? Then there's the physical. So these are things like metal, stones, twigs, things like that. 4th, once you've figured out your plan, then you have to implement that plan. And that can be done through many different ways. And again, you need to put this all down in writing and explain why you're doing it or why you're not doing it. FDA has to see that. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So maybe you've got an RTD product. You want to run that through a thermal process because you're going to put it on the shelf. It doesn't need to be cold. But then you need to look at all your thermal processing authority parts of the GMPs, so it expands your window. Again, from allergens, how do you separate them, labeling, and things like that, just as some prime examples. Now you're implementing. Now you've got to monitor, verify, and correct. So your PCQI individual needs to make sure that the systems you put in place are running correctly and monitoring correctly. Then you need somebody that's also qualified and trained to say, yep, the system is working. They're going to come in behind it, make sure the values are correct, the system is on point. Then what happens if something breaks down? It's inevitable to happen. We're always going to learn and correct. In that case, do a root cause, see why it happened, correct, put in something in place. But if you go out and deviate in your plan, you need to put that product on hold, right? Because you've now fallen out of plan. You can release it if you can show it's been safe, but again, put it down in writing, go through the process of what that looks like so that the FDA feels confident when they come and review or audit you at a later date that you've done the right thing for the consumer. Again, it's about prevention in this case. And that is really, if you saw all those things we talked about, because they could have been prevented if you thought about the ice cream or the Chipotle issues. This is why FDA wants industry to be part of that plan. Now finally, let's hit on foreign supplier verification program as a few key highlights. Coffee comes from across the world in a very complex supply chain, right? So what does that mean? We'll go over the definitions of what that looks like. So who and what is a foreign supplier? In this case, it's pretty straightforward. You could be growing something, you could be harvesting something, you could be producing something and packaging it, sending it into the United States. You are a foreign supplier and must meet foreign supplier verification program. But who needs to ensure the foreign supplier is meeting that plan? That is defined by who the importer is. So maybe you're having cookies for your cafe, you're going direct to buy those outside the US. You need to make sure that you're asking the right questions of that supplier, that they meet the plan. In most cases, you're probably going through a distributor, but that distributor, being the importer of record, is actually the one to ensure that that company is following this foreign supplier again in that process. Now, in the registration process, if a foreign supplier were to say, FDA, I'm not going to let you come in and audit, at that time, the FDA will just remove their registration number, and they'll no longer be able to bring that product into market, into the US. And then 3, there are some exemptions. Again, you can look at juice, you can look at seafood, alcohol. They really have their own regulatory setup on their food safety applications already. So the FDA said those are good enough, we're not going to change those. Meats are really governed by the United States Department of Agriculture. And then trans-shipped products. So those are products that come into the US, they're going to be repackaged or reshifted into other products, repacked, put back in a container, and out they go. Never for a planned consumption or selling in the United States. Those are exempt from foreign supplier as well. So now, in our last little bit of time, let's really kind of look into coffee a little bit. And what do these things mean? How do we rethink about the process of preventive controls? We can go right up front. Very complex. Look at all these touch points. Start thinking about what we just talked about. What are some risks that could be introduced throughout this process? There's a lot of water. We know microbes love water. The beans are being dried out in the open air. You've got rodents, you've got birds, you've got sticks and rocks, everything out there in the system, right? So what are the questions you need to ask? Well, here's what's interesting about green coffee. Green coffee is actually not in a consumable state at that point in time. So when it comes into the United States, because it's not in a consumable state, it's actually not part of foreign supplier verification. It's now your job as the roaster in the United States to take on all responsibility for your preventive controls when you roast that coffee and make sure you're answering the right questions that I've taken care of my risks. Okay, that's green coffee. Let's talk about roasted coffee. What if you're bringing roasted coffee in from outside? That company is responsible and must be part of foreign supplier verification. Now let's quickly talk on cascara. I know some of you guys are in the innovation world, which is great. We want to see that. But you still need to ask your question, one, is it grass? Just because cascara may have been used in another country prior to 1958 doesn't mean it's been used in the United States prior to 1958. Right? So just make sure you're asking the right question. Work with an ingredient supplier that may have done some work with the FDA, or they've done some self-grass work on that. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's just making sure you've asked the right risks that you could be bringing in by using a new ingredient. Okay, so now you've brought it in, and again, because it's going to go through a roast step, we know high temperature the roasters are going to hit. It's going to kill off any of your possibility of a biological at that point. All right, so that'll be part of your plan. But what happens after it leaves the roaster, goes into package, right? Making sure, again, that your PCQI individual has looked to say that there's no other opportunities for risk from that stage forward. Right, so that's, again, going to be individualistic per roaster, because not all of our roasting sites are the same. So it has to be per person and per roast. So just quickly, as we start to wrap up here, these are some quick links. If you're a regulatory wonk like I am and really want to go in and read and learn more and see kind of how you can manage it, here's some websites. Go to the FDA, great place to start. If you have insomnia, great place to start. Go check it out. But the key one there is at the bottom. Preventive controlled individual training. They're all over the country in all different regions. Look them up, find one, make sure you're sending somebody to learn from that and get certified in that process. NCA even has had one before, and they focused on coffee, and they were certified to do that. So that those individuals that attended, hopefully we'll see some more of those in the future from some of the other education sides. So to wrap up, let's bring ourselves back to what we are. A very complex supply chain from tree to cup. There's a lot of little things along the way, from good microbes to bad microbes, that we always have to think about. But in the end, we all are looking to drive for a safe, great tasting cup of coffee that we can have joy with every day. So with that, I say thank you to the organizers, thank you to everybody else, and thank you for your time and attention.